Hello, and welcome to the Iaconian Archives. I am the Archivist, your host and reader. In this episode, I will be sharing an excerpt from Assumptio by author ParadiseParrot, a tale of a child orphaned by events at the end of the More Than Meets the Eye comics series. So pour yourself a glass of NGEX, get comfortable at your console or in your berth, close your optics, and let's enter the archives. Deathsaurus had wanted, no, the right word was demanded, an explanation, but apparently his shock and panic had spiked his core temperature enough to prick Nickel's scanner and cause her to fuss. The little creature in one arm and her scanner in the other, she had browbeat Deathsaurus back into his own office and bustled, of course, to hide the whole ridiculous situation. Honestly, I know it's a shock, but you Warframe mechs, don't sit there, she snapped as Deathsaurus reached towards the most comfortable chair. I'm putting him there so I can talk, and don't you disturb him while I explain. He needs his rest. Deathsaurus allowed Nickel to set the sparklet down, optics on him all the time, as she turned and scanned his temperature. He sat elsewhere while she fussed and watched the little thing stare back. Newborns all started malleable, but sparklets had systems so humble they couldn't even speak for themselves. Has he been here this whole time? Deathsaurus asked finally, hearing the disbelief in his own voice. And, as I recall, it takes two to make these. An Autobot carried. Nickel's voice had gone flat. There's a little outpost on Mesotine, and Tarn was getting his T-cogs there for a while. His transplants, too, for a while. I'd put my wheel down about his relationship. Deathsaurus looked from Nickel's wide eyes to the sparklets, dimming in rest. Autobots would never abandon something helpless, and that, he said, pointing at the creature, is helpless, yes, Nickel snapped. Tarn found him in the snow after the outpost was abandoned, so obviously they would. There was a note on his wrist, but I haven't read it. I'm sure it's among Tarn's things. He tried to figure out how to respond. Primus himself might have had to think about how to approach this madness, and for a moment Deathsaurus just watched the sparklet. A moment later, feeling no more enlightened, and settled on the best he could come up with. May I hold him? Nickel stared. For a full minute. Deathsaurus thought she would turn and go, taking Tarn's offspring with her, but instead she grumbled and rolled forward. Bend down. Now, careful. Yes, that's right. Support his head. The cables need to strengthen. The little thing had no weight in Deathsaurus's arms. For someone who had been locked up for so long, he seemed to have settled in just fine, snuggling himself further into his arms. Deathsaurus was stunned. Were all sparklets this trusting? He likes everyone at first, Nickel said, leaning over him. When the sparklet saw her, he smiled and waved one tiny fist. Deathsaurus smiled too. The first time since all this had come to a head. It had slipped right onto his face like a virus. Only at first? Deathsaurus asked. He didn't even glance her way, watching as the sparklet took hold of one of his fingers. He held tight, and Deathsaurus marveled, again, at the miniature features. He was scared of Voss, Helix, and Thesaurus, Nickel said. One snarl and he was done with them, though he was always safe. Tarn wouldn't have let something happen. She sighed and reached out to stroke the sparklet's cheek. They were starting to warm up to him, but what happened is probably for the best. Does he have a name? Deathsaurus asked. Nickel scowled. Tyrannus Megatronus, she said, and Deathsaurus resisted the sudden, surprising urge to laugh. Our Decepticon heir needed a noble name, you see. That will have to change, he said. The blue helm and feet were bright on the little one's deep purple plating, strikingly so. He would have to think about this. Such a small thing doesn't need a name with such pointless weight. I've been calling him Ty when Tarn can't hear, but yes. There was a ghost of a smile on Nickel's face, too, a relieved one. Glad to hear he gets to stay aboard. Deathsaurus looked up at her sharply. "Where else would we send him?" he asked, because it was the most obvious thing in the world. His war world had multitudes of wide hallways that a sparklet could run through in an upgrade's time, plenty of windows through which they could look, and Deathsaurus could teach him the constellations, plenty of mechs who understood Squadron's loyalty and would extend that to this new, very small member. Nickel stared at him. "I knew you'd have to know. It's your ship now, and if you'd tried to hurt him, I would have reformatted you, but I thought you'd at least dump him off on a mechanical world." She grinned. "Preonians liked babies, but generally Decepticons do not. You Cybertronians have no experience." Deathsaurus cracked a smile in return, and it was easier than he'd expected. The sparklet, tiny, unfortunate Tyrannus, made a small sound, and right away Deathsaurus looked down, observed briefly that he was frowning, and had let go of his finger. "He needs to be energized," Nichols said. "He hasn't been getting enough with the preparations. Tarn wouldn't let me stay with him, but still my fault." Anger curled in Deathsaurus's spark, and he pushed it down hard. "Why was he kept hidden? I would not have harmed him." "Tarn's strict orders," Nichols said, shrugging. "He was paranoid something would change if you knew, or that you would steal him." "A real possibility," Deathsaurus said, a ghost of a smile on his face. With Overlord a factor, too, maybe it was lucky he'd been hidden. "I'm not above admitting that I'm rather taken with him." "Good to hear." Nickel smiled too, then held out her arms. "Now hand him over. He takes his ration from a bottle. I'll take him and let you stew over this development." Before he could stop himself, Deathsaurus's grip had tightened on the sparklet. Barely a fraction, certainly not enough to hurt him. Nickel tilted her head. His spark flared, flustered. "If I am to take on this child," he said, tone careful, "I should learn how to care for him. My chief medical officer cannot be saddled with the whole responsibility." "I forgot you're not above real work." Nickel rolled backwards, then jumped daintily down from her chair. "You've got to do it right, or that fuss will turn into wailing, let me tell you. Worse than Deathsaurus when it was time to clean out his seams." When Deathsaurus addressed his troops, it was standing only a fraction above their heads. He wasn't much for displays. He had thrown out Tarn's statues of Megatron and his throne, and still felt uncomfortable above the mechs who gave him everything. Still, this was how they could all see him. By extension, this meant they could all see that in his arms was a tiny, sleeping sparklet. At first, no one had said anything, but he could see his second-in-command in front, bursting from his seams with curiosity. "What is that?" Leozak finally asked. Of course he had cut Deathsaurus off too, jerking a thumb towards the child. He reacted with practiced calm, turning his optics to meet his seconds. "I ask you to lower your volume," he said. "This child needs his rest." Deathsaurus had little dramatic flair, but he did enjoy the ripple of murmurs through his troops. "Child?" Leozak snapped, voice already edging on hysterical. The sparklet stirred, and Deathsaurus pushed down his annoyance. Starscream Light was not a nickname Deathsaurus endorsed, but his troops weren't wrong about it. "Yes," Deathsaurus said. "Actually, now that I've discussed the upcoming memorial and our next steps, I should sate your curiosity." He bounced the sparklet gently in his arms, like this was the most normal thing in the world. "This child was sired by Tarn, but seeing as Tarn is no longer with us—" At that, he waved his hand, and his troops grumbled angrily. "This child is now my son. He is ours, and we will raise him as well as we are able." Leozak went blessedly silent, jaw slack. Beside him, next to the front of the crowd, Nickel grinned, and the troops rippled again with their shocked murmurs. Solon was already waggling fingers at the sparklet, grinning with delight as his eyes opened, and Deathsaurus finally relaxed.
You can find this story posted in its entirety at archiveofourown.org, along with nearly 40,000 original Transformers transformative works. Give it a read and let the author know what you thought. Comments and kudos encourage authors to keep producing their art. Please subscribe to this channel and you'll know when new videos are posted. As always, comments and suggestions are welcome below. If you would like to suggest a story or a selection from a longer fanfic for reading here on the Iaconian Archives, please view our video from the archivist suggesting content, and you could hear me read some of your favorite Transformers fanfiction. From tonight's author and myself, thank you for your time and support.